something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over
could not
there.
talk and would not listen. How'd you like to hear about the war? He might have asked, but the place could only blink and shrug. It had no memory, therefore no guilt. It was a brisk, polite town. It did not know shit about shit and did not care to know.
Hi, I'm Seabree DePreter.
I'm Devin Lehman.
And I'm Emily Lindsay.
And this is our podcast for Speaking of Courage, chapter in The Things I Carried by Tim O'Brien.
For this chapter, we are analyzing it with the psychological approach, which focuses on uncovering the meaning of a work by revealing the motivations of the characters. The first question is, what motivates a character's behavior, and how does understanding a character's behavior help magnify the meaning of the text? The first part of the question, what motivates a character's behavior, focuses on Norman Bowker's return to his hometown and the life he lived before the war. After seeing what he saw in the war and how often he contemplates Kiowa's death, he is uncomfortable with discussing the effects that the war had on him.
Right, so when the text says the high school girls were mostly gone or married, it depicts how much he felt that he didn't fit into his own town. The place symbolizes the majority of America and exactly what the soldiers were returning to and how they'd been forgotten and replaced.
So what motivates a lot of Norman's character is the judgment that the town places on him about how he didn't have the right medal for valor. A good war story, he thought, but it was not a war for war stories, nor for talk of valor, and nobody in town wanted to know about the terrible stink. They wanted good intentions and good deeds.
Yeah, and that goes back to how the war was perceived, because it wasn't really America's war. It was to stop the spread of communism, so the war didn't make the soldiers valiant, and they didn't really fight for America, so they weren't viewed as heroes. The whole general perception of the returning soldiers was falsified because the general population was against the war. The second part of the question is, how does understanding a character's behavior help magnify the meaning of the text? So to answer the question, we need to focus on Norman's general behavior.
Norman keeps his conflict internal and doesn't know how to approach the topic, so he's a very quiet and modest man.
Right, it's because of his character that he is quietly ashamed for not receiving the Medal of Valor, because every other medal he received was the bravery required for every soldier. And following this, he hated that he received a medal for an injury that, quote-unquote, wasn't much of a wound and did not leave a scar and did not hurt and never had.
So this reiterates that he's a modest man and that his struggle for Kiowa's death is internal, and he feels the pressure that he doesn't actually have from the townspeople.
His behavior of being too shy and quiet to bring it up magnifies that he continues to go around and around, stuck in circles with his conflict. He can't express what he needs to do.
Norman felt like he was trapped in a cage inside of himself. The next question is, what does our reaction to the text reveal about our own fears and desires? First part of the question is, what does our reaction to the text reveal about our own fears and desires? To answer this, there needs to be a focus on Norman's fears and desires so we can compare and contrast between our own and his.
In the chapter, it's hard to pinpoint Norman's own desires, but in the following chapter, it notes Tim O'Brien involves what Norman Bowker actually told him while he was still alive. He had enrolled in the junior college in his hometown, but the coursework, he had said, seemed too abstract, too distant, with nothing real or tangible at stake, certainly not the stakes of war.
This really brings out Norman's true character and sort of his fear and desire of not finding a place to go and that he'll never find a place to fit in. Again, O'Brien quotes Bowker in the chapter as saying, "The thing is, there's no place to go. Not just in this lousy little town. In general. My life, I mean."
We can all collectively agree that the feeling of being left out and forgotten is a fearful prospect. Bowker expected life to pause while he was gone, but instead it continued to advance, and he had nowhere to go and no one to speak with about the most important and traumatizing part of his life. O'Brien can relate to Bowker's emotions because he also desires to tell people the events that transpired around him in the war, and he has a realization of the fear of what bottling up the images of war can do to a person's psychological state. The text reveals that society has no desire to be involved with the war. They do not want to experience any unpleasantries and do not fear what effect it will have on America because the battle doesn't take place on their home front.
So the ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. So the ego develops in order to mediate between the unrealistic id and the external real world. So it operates according to the reality principle. which sort of works our way around the realistic ways of satisfying its demands, which often compromises or postpones the satisfaction. So the superego is sort of incorporating the values and morals of society, which are learned from one's parents and others. So it sort of controls the id's impulses, like with Eros and Thanatos, and it functions of persuading the ego to turn to moralistic goals rather than simply realistic ones, and to strive for perfection. So the superego consists of two systems, the conscience and the ideal self. The conscience can punish the ego through feelings of guilt, and for example, if the ego gives in to id demands, the superego may make. I'm really screwing this up really badly.
I feel like this should be something that we're both talking about.
Do you want to talk about the ideal self?
Okay. So the ideal, the
conscience.
Oh, the conscience? Yeah. Okay. The superego consists of two systems, the conscious and conscience.
We're gonna do it right.
Okay. The superego consists of two systems, the conscience and the ideal self. The conscience can punish the ego through feelings of guilt, and for example, like, the ego gives in to the id commands, and the superego may make the person feel bad through guilt.
And the ideal self is an imaginary picture of how you ought to be, and represents aspirations and how we treat other people, and our own general behavior as members of society. The id in the text is, in the beginning of the chapter, it says that he's feeling safe inside his father's big Chevy. So it's sort of that parental influence that he was forced to grow up in the war, and now he feels safe and secure in his father's car like he did when he was younger and as he was a child before he matured. So another event of the id is how he talks about going on the lake before the war with Sally Kramer, and other times with friends, and sort of how he would take his girlfriend and friends out to hang around, and that was sort of his pleasure drive, was to be with other people, which sort of shows the contrast between how he feels now that he can't express that anymore and that he has no one else to speak to, and that was really how he dealt with his own pleasure drive. And the main ego in the text was sort of how he saw Max Arnold's, his best friend, who died in the lake, and that it was sort of like Max was just an idea, which was sort of a comparison with his need for a friend to a need for a belief. And that's the ego because it finds the balance between the pleasure drive and his moral and ethical needs. So the main superego of the text is how he's sort of been brought up to not talk about the things that he needs to talk about. It's sort of how his parents sort of formed him to be more modest about what he needs. And this is apparent on page 146 when he's speaking with the person at the restaurant, and he's saying, "What do you really need, friend?" And Norman sort of is conflicted here when he starts to explain what he needs, and he says, "Well," he said, "how do you like to hear about?" He stopped and shook his head. "Hear what, man? Nothing." And so he's sort of got the superego of not being able to express what he really needs, and his balance is sort of hindered by that because he's been taught to be modest, and that's become such a strong part of his character that he doesn't know how to come out of that anymore.
Because of how the Vietnam War was viewed by those who didn't fight in it, coming back from the war was basically entering a new world. The atmosphere was harsh and not understanding, and it made it impossible for soldiers to talk about their experiences and hardships of the war. Due to how drastic the changes were, going from being surrounded by fellow soldiers to unaffected civilians was a harsh difference.
She stood in the street, smiled.